Okay, so this is my first podcast, right? And I am excited to have Greg Satell with me here. He is a transformation and change expert, international keynote speaker, and best-selling author of Cascades: How to Create a Movement That Drives Transformational Change. Here, I have the book here, so you can see that. Actually, it's an awesome book. I met Greg earlier this year, read the book. You have a welcome, Greg.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me, Lenwood.
It's my pleasure. So you have a very novel approach to transformation. We hear a lot in the news, in the business news, about how transformations often fail. And I'm going to say something here that will ruffle a few feathers, not yours, but if change management was something that worked, we wouldn't have so many transformations, right, that fail, because most people think it's some sort of a change management issue, and that's why the transformation aren't working. Can you share your view on change management, why it doesn't work, and what it is that will work with transformational change?
Well, I don't think it's just an issue with change management. I mean, business thinking is shoddy. When you look at what passes for business research, I mean, it's often ridden with errors that wouldn't fly in any field, such as survivorship bias, right? You look at something like blue ocean strategy or many of the others, and you see so often in some of the top schools, research coming out of, blue ocean strategy came out of the INSEAD, which is one of the best business schools in the world. And you look and you say, okay, and they have all this supposed research about companies that follow this strategy do so much better than companies that don't. But they didn't look at the ones that failed. It's something known. It's a very well-known error called survivorship bias. It doesn't fly in any other field. You can't have medical research and just ignore people who died. You can't test airplanes and just ignore the prototypes that crashed. No other field would that fly.
Right.
There's written confirmation bias, respondent bias, all of these things. And I think with change management, it comes down to a lot of it comes down to what Daniel Kahneman calls what you see is all there is. So people go and see a successful transformation and they say, that's how transformations succeed. And I can tell you, because I saw it and I saw that it worked.
Right.
So now I'm going to assume that that's how all transformations will work. And if you look at the work of, say, John Kotter, where he says that emotive statements, emotional persuasion is much more effective than analytical persuasion, that people act on what they feel more than they act on what they think. That is absolutely true. And in some cases, that can get people to change. In the vast majority of cases, it will not. So if what you see is all there is, and you say, well, emotive arguments are much more effective than analytical arguments, what people feel versus facts and figures, that is absolutely true. It just won't be effective in the vast majority of cases. People change for all sorts of reasons. They change what they think and what they do. They will change if they are coerced. If you tell somebody they will be fired, that can change their behavior.
Right.
probably not the best way to go about. But if you look throughout, I would say the biggest reason that the best indicator, and there is research all across literally dozens of fields that show that this is true. The best indicator of what people think and what they do is what people around them think and what people around them do.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense.
And in that, you can see, having read Cascades, you know that's a big part of it. Learning how to shape those networks. And then finally, overcoming resistance. Anytime you set out to make a significant impact, there are going to be people that aren't going to like it. Yeah. And they're going to work to undermine you in ways that are dishonest and underhanded and deceptive. And once you understand that, you can begin to move forward. But again, when you look at traditional change management models, if you look at something like ProSci, they do have modules for overcoming resistance, but they always assume that the resistance has a rational basis. And anybody who's ever been married or had kids knows that's not true. Knows that's not a good assumption to make. Very often, it has no rational basis. The fact is that we all have attachments to things, to people, to ideas. And when we feel those attachments are being attacked, it offends our identity, our dignity, our sense of self. And you can convince people to look at alternative facts. You can convince people to maybe try something new. You cannot convince someone to be, you cannot convince anybody to be somebody else than who they think they are.
Right.
And that's what you run up against. So unless you're able to account for that, you're going to run into problems.
That is fascinating. So you brought up a couple of things which, just raise questions in my mind about, okay, so when you're thinking about starting a change initiative and you know that you're going to come up against resistance, what is the best way to get started and to make sure that that change initiative, catches fire, so to speak?
Well, we know that the best indicator of what people think and what they do is what the people around them think and what people around them do. So you want to start with the majority.
Okay.
And it's interesting what human nature is. I mean, to have irrational attachments to things is something we all do, and we'll all act irrationally. So we shouldn't be thinking those as unreasonable people. We need to be thinking those as people just like ourselves, that have irrational attachments.
Right.
But for some reason, there's just like that's a quirk in our sort of emotional, cognitive hardwiring. Another quirk in human nature is when we feel passionate about a change. When we always want to go and convince the skeptics.
Right.
Don't do that. You're not gonna persuade them. You're not gonna convince them. They're not, as my friend Bob Berg says, nobody's ever said, I felt really strongly about something, but then I went on social media and I completely changed my mind.
Right.
That never happens.
Yeah.
So, but there's no reason that you need to go and convince the skeptics. Start with a majority. Start with people who are already enthusiastic, who feel as you do, and then it's going to be much easier to gain traction. And that will lead you to that first initial keystone change. And then you can always expand a majority out. Once you're in the minority, you'll immediately feel it. It'll be like whiplash. The good news is there is decades of research that shows the tipping point for change is nowhere near 51%.
Right.
Nowhere close. There's most likely it's somewhere between 10 and 25%.
Which is
Everett
pretty low.
Rogers put it at 10 to 25%. More recent research has put it at 25. I'm not so sure about that particular research. Erica Chenoweth's research into political revolutions, it puts it at 3% of a society. But I think that 10 to 25% is kind of a good range to look at.
But that 20 to 25%, is that of the whole universe of people? Like, for example, in an organization, or might that just be a business unit? If you get to 10% of a business unit, is that enough to, make that change happen?
I don't know. And I don't know how you count those things. Like, I don't know who Erica Chenoweth was counting. I've never been able to, for her 3%. The 25% that came out of the University of Pennsylvania, that was a experimental value. So they did experiments, and that's supposedly of a company. The 10 to 25% is supposed to be of a system. So, and remember, Everett Rogers was about the how innovations take hold and the early adopters and so on and so forth. I don't think you actually need to know exactly what the percentage is. Right. I mean, I think it's roughly that there are three groups of people: people who really like this idea, people who hate this idea, and most people in the middle who go along. So once you get to this tipping point that you can, so let's say the 25%, once you hit that tipping point, that middle 50%, it's pretty easy to get from 25% to 75%, let's say, where it can be incredibly hard to go from 0% to 10%. So until you get to that 10%, you need to be very, very careful. Right. And keep it to people who you don't want to be persuading anybody. You want to keep it to people who are already enthusiastic, or at least not fighting it. I mean, the majority needs to be enthusiastic, and then you need to show it can work somewhere, somehow. And then you can start bringing others in who bring in others. Still, very much like I described in Cascades, small groups, loosely connected, united by a shared purpose. And we've seen this work in organizations. So once you get to that and it's working and people want to do it, so the first stage is very much opt-in. Who wants to try and make this work? The second stage is more performance-based. Those guys over there, they're doing pretty well with it. We're not going to force you, but they're doing better than you are. So you might want to, and if you can't make that argument, you shouldn't be pushing the change. Right. And
So there's two things that you said there that really stood out to me. I mean, more than two, but two that I want to kind of pull the string on. One is this idea of starting a change initiative kind of with a small group in the middle and working out, versus this idea of starting with this, big change announcement from the top of the organization. We're going to do this big thing, and
which triggers opposition.
Exactly. Right? That was the point that I was going to make, is that when you start with this kind of a top-down initiative, hey, we're going to do this big thing, the next thing you know, people in the organization at all levels begin to resist. And that may lead to, that's one of the reasons why a top-down change initiative like that will often fail, right?
Well, change is never top down or bottom up. It's always side to side.
Okay.
Right? You'll find levels of resistance at every level of the organization, but I don't think you want to start in the middle. You want to start over on the edge.
Okay.
You want to start over on the edge with people who love this idea and want to make it work. And then you want to start bringing people in, hey, we're doing this thing. We really got great results. Do you want to see how you can do it as well? There's a case study I've written about in Procter & Gamble, where they sort of got to this kind of prototype stage where one guy did, and he started bringing people in, and within 6 months it became a movement of 1,800 people, and now it's a couple of years into it, and it's 50,000 people who've joined this movement within Procter & Gamble called PXG, and they've saved the company apparently billions of dollars.
That's awesome.
And it was 100% opt-in. Nobody was forced.
And it was just starting small and building it. As
I wouldn't even say starting small.
Okay.
Is you start with enthusiasts. You start with a majority. He wasn't going to anybody. He wasn't convincing anybody. He was going and finding people around the world who were excited about it. And if you weren't excited about it, he didn't talk to you, and you didn't care.
Right.
You weren't. It wasn't. You weren't being forced to do anything about it, and it wasn't affecting you. But you still get resistance. You can get resistance to anything. It's incredible. But again, back to what I find incredible is when you look at change, you need to look. Change is not transformation, and change is not a business issue, right? That's a human issue.
Right.
And what I find amazing about so much of the change management stuff, they never look at change, say, in a society or a political change. There are changes all across, and we know what works. We have decades of, because again, you know how it is with what happens in an organization. We only hear about it if it's successful. Again, we never hear about failures. So we have issues with survivorship bias.
Right.
Also, when we do hear about them, it's usually when a business school professor or consultant or a small team of researchers goes and interviews a half dozen or maybe a dozen people in the organization, and then they write up a case study. And don't get me wrong, that can be helpful. Mm-hmm. And I think most people who do it are at least trying to be honest and somewhat rigorous about it. They don't always achieve it, but I think they try. But that's nothing compared to something like a social or political movement or transformation, where we have literally thousands upon thousands, if not millions, of firsthand accounts that have been documented at like an incredible level. Yeah. And I think one of the reasons change management fails is that you look at that incredible body of knowledge and research over a century, or in some cases longer, and you don't see it anywhere. They don't even look. I mean, sometimes there's some allusion to something Martin Luther King said or Gandhi or something, but no real, and there is, the work of people like Gene Sharp, who pretty much created this whole discipline of nonviolent struggle and has published widely on it. He was a terrible writer, which is part of the reason more people don't know of his work. But Srdja Popovic, who has done, published this at the Center of Applied Nonviolent Action and Strategies, or Canvas. There is very exciting work going on right now involving something called a dilemma action, which has been very, very successful in political and social revolutions, and have been going on for like a century. But what he did and what he's doing is going and actually codifying it and coming up with design principles.
Nice.
And we found it very, very effective with our clients, where you design an action where your opposition has two choices and both of them are bad. Right? So, I mean, think about Birmingham with Martin Luther King and Bull Connor. Bull Connor had two choices. He could let Martin Luther King march pretty much unmolested, which would undermine his authority as he saw it.
Right.
Or he could have attacked the protesters, which is what he did.
What he did, right.
Either one of those things would be bad for him.
Yeah.
So the question is, I mean, you can see how that is, it would be, you know, that's a good thing to be able to engineer.
Right.
And so having those design principles are incredibly valuable. Starts with the shared value or widely held belief. Right?
Yes. Yeah.
And then you design a constructive act around that widely held belief. Hopefully, you know, ideally there's a element of surprise and it's time for impact, but it forces a decision. And you know what each one of those choices are, so you're prepared for either one. Now, that comes from way outside the business world, but you can see how it would be very effective.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, that to be able to do that.
You can see how it's effective, but what you're raising here, which is so important, is that the change is actually about people. So looking at how movements occur. I mean, kind of touched on it, but I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about that, because you've kind of alluded to it, that a movement, building a movement, is a much more constructive way of getting people to change, because that's how they change. This idea of identifying shared value, shared
it's
purpose.
No different in, you know, it's no different in a community or society than it is in an organization. I mean, the fun, we know that to be true. We know that from a network perspective. We know that from a psychological perspective, and we know that from a historical perspective. We know how these things work. We know how viral cascades work because of breakthroughs in network science in the late 90s. We know how to organize. We know lots of things about how to overcome opposition from decades of research into social and political movements. We know all of those things. Unfortunately, with the practice of change management, they've only looked at business case studies, which end up being what you see is all there is.
Yeah.
Just because in resources, you can't, college professors, business school professors or consultants, they're not going to, just the capacity to go and interview customers and partners and suppliers. And that it's really, really difficult to do compared to, thousands upon thousands of professional historians and other people who are going through documents, and that's their life. There are people who spend their entire careers researching the civil rights movement or anti-apartheid or, the color revolutions that I was involved in. So there is a lot of work and research that's gone into what makes them work and why the ones that fail. So I think that the biggest reason why change management fails is there just hasn't been the kind of rigorous work done in the business community to really get an understanding of it.
Right. And would you say that,
except for my book, Cascades?
Well,
I mean, but that really was what I was working on in Cascades. Okay, because I think a key principle always has to be, don't believe everything you think.
Yeah.
And that's why, and I can tell you, I always fact check my books. Always. I send out every aspect. I send out to an expert or somebody who had firsthand knowledge or whatever it was. I make really, really dumb mistakes. I mean, and not like just bad judgment. I mean, complete factual screw ups that I shouldn't have made. And each time I'm just like, how did I get that so incredibly wrong?
Right.
And it's embarrassing.
Yeah.
It'd be a whole lot more embarrassing if I actually published it.
Yeah, right. If the book went out like
fact check. But it's so difficult to get something right. That's why, that's why there are processes like red teams and postmortems to say, okay, this is what I think. How am I getting it wrong? But first of all, you don't see that enough at all in terms of business thought, but you also don't see it in change management. There is a lot of certification and all this stuff that goes on, but not one bit of it is sourced. They say you should do this, you should do that. They don't say, and this is backed up by research and we can be transparent about why we think this is true.
Right.
There's no falsifiability. There's no this is what we think and this is why we think it. And if you think differently, here's how you can check our sources. There's just, we think a lot of things.
Whether it's stuff that's relevant or not, who knows? Hey, so, we're coming up to the end of our time, but you talk about something in your book that I think is really important. And I wanted to raise it. You say that the victory stage of a change is actually the most dangerous part. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. And again, that really comes from my friend Sir Ja, but and we experienced that in Ukraine. You can see it in places like Egypt. So many of these revolutions, we thought we had won in 2004 and 5 in the Orange Revolution in Ukraine. Turns out we didn't, which is why there was another revolution, a decade later. But it's interesting why it happens. And it happens because when we think that we won that initial victory, right? I mean, think again about those people who hate this idea and are and want to kill it in ways that are, dishonest and underhanded and deceptive. They're willing to play along for a little bit. So we're thinking, hey, once I get that first initial victory, once I get my budget approved, or I get executive sponsorship, once my boss gives me the go ahead, everything should be downhill from there. But actually, it's usually the opposite. Why? Now that they see change is possible, that's when the knives. That's when they see the need to attack.
Yeah, sabotage.
That's when they sound the alarm. When you're saying, hey, we're over here, we're trying, we have this other, okay, it'll never fail.
Exactly.
But once they see it and succeed, and that's exactly what happened to us in Ukraine. We thought once we had that initial victory, well, the opposition, they'll just see that we were right all along. Yeah, and they'll just melt away and go home. And that's really what we thought. The whole country thought that. I mean, it was really, really dumb. There's no reason. I mean, we thought that it was over,
Yeah.
and it's never over.
Never over.
So that's why surviving victory is so important, that you anticipate that. And one of the things we ask people in workshops, we say, okay, how would an evil person undermine the change?
Wow. How does
And
Dr. Evil, right?
now, we don't actually think people who oppose change are evil, but it's an important thought experiment,
Right.
because that evokes the imagination. And that's what you have to do, is not say, oh, far too many of this is, oh, this change is great, and once people understand it, they're going to embrace it, and everybody are going to love it, and there's going to be ticker tape parades, and I'm going to get a big promotion in my picture on, cover of Fortune or whatever. No, it's not going to happen. People are going to see, this change, and they're going to want to attack it, because, again, and not everybody, but there's always going to be people. If it's going to have a significant impact, people are going to hate it for reasons that don't have a rational logic. They have their basis in attachment, identity, and dignity. And you start brushing up against somebody's dignity and identity and sense of self, you will get a violent reaction. And it won't come from a rational place.
Awesome stuff. So the book is Cascades. This is a great book. I recommend everyone to read it.
I think you need to move it, because it's a little blurry there.
Oh,
Lenwood.
there we go. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's transformational change. It's a great handbook. Greg, where can people find you and more information about your work and get in contact with you?
Well, my blog is digitaltonto.com, and you can always get me at gregsatell.com as well. So those are two very simple places. Of course, LinkedIn, I'm always happy to connect. And I'm always walking every morning. I'm walking my dog on Clubhouse.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Greg.
Thanks for having me.